Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
For tuning into the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah. Hello and welcome to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you for this last Sunday in Lent. It's the fifth Sunday in Lent, but it's also the last Sunday in Lent. Next Sunday is Palm Sunday. It's going to be a little different this year, worshiping from home. I hope that you are all doing well. I hope that if you are a non-essential employee, you are staying home, staying safe, staying well, and helping to flatten that curve. But it is going to make for a much different Palm Sunday and Holy Week starting next Sunday. By staying at home, you know, one of the things that many of us love about Palm Sunday is that procession where lots of churches start outside and they read the Palm Sunday gospel from this year. It's from Matthew, and then they take their palms and they sing. You know, sometimes they process in singing and then start worship or continue worship, inside the sanctuary. And this year we won't be doing that because we are worshiping in various ways from home. And the two churches I work with both have different ideas for how they are going to make the procession and Palm Sunday happen and seem like Palm Sunday. So I'm anxious and eager to find out how those services go next week. But it is the last Sunday in Lent, and we have been continuing this Lenten journey. We have been walking with Jesus towards Jerusalem. We have been seeing acts of power as he has continued to reveal who he is as the Messiah, and has tried to prepare his disciples for that time when they do get to Jerusalem and everything that happens in that passion narrative afterwards. So a lot of Lenten journeying and those stories that we hear during Lent. I am going to read the gospel for today to you. It's very familiar to many people. It is the story of the raising of Lazarus. That story comes to us from the Gospel of John. And that text is from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 45. So it is a rather extensive reading. It goes like this. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and you are going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them. After saying this, he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right. Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, and they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed home. Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again." Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and seen what Jesus did, believed in him. So as I mentioned, this is the gospel text assigned for the last Sunday in Lent, for April 2nd, the week of April 2nd. And it's a long text, as I said. It's 45 verses. It's a long story, but it is an appropriate story for this time of the season because we are traveling with Jesus to Jerusalem. There's a lot of things that jump out at me from this story. I've often asked you, what do you hear when you hear stories? Did you hear anything new? Did you hear anything differently this time through? And for me, there's always a few things that jump out at me, and a few new things jumped out at me with this reading, but the beginning is always difficult for me because Jesus receives word that Lazarus is ill, and yet he stays where he is for 2 days longer. And then when he says that they are going, he says, "We must go, we're going to Lazarus," and his disciples start asking him questions, and he says then that Lazarus is dead. So he knows that he's waited and Lazarus is dead. So, you can look at that as Jesus is using this opportunity to show the glory of God, show what he can do as the Messiah, what he can do through God's gifts in him. But it still always bugs me a little bit that Jesus does wait, that Lazarus does die. And I understand that, the way the story turns out and Lazarus is raised. But I always have that feeling of, oh man, Jesus, just go to your friend. He's sick and his sisters are worried and, they're asking for you. So it always gets me a little bit emotionally when I hear the beginning of that story. But today as I was reading through it, it struck me how very appropriate this is for the week before Holy Week, for the week before we travel with Jesus to Jerusalem from Palm Sunday to Good Friday and to Easter. Because it is kind of a microcosm of Jesus' own story. Now, Lazarus is not resurrected. He is resuscitated. So that's something to remember. He's resuscitated. He's brought back to life, whereas Jesus is resurrected. He is he's taken from the dead. He is raised from the dead. It's a slightly different, it's a nuance, but it's important. Lazarus is not the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah. So Lazarus is resuscitated. He will live out the rest of his life. He will eventually die again, whereas Jesus will not. But you see that there is this kind of, as I said, microcosm of Holy Week. So Jesus comes to the city. He's met by a crowd. It's not the cheering crowds of Palm Sunday, but he's met by Martha. But then when Mary comes out, the people who are with her as she grieves come out too. So there's this crowd coming out to see Jesus. They start asking questions of him. Why wasn't he here? He wouldn't have let him die if he had been here. He's the man who opened the eyes of the blind man. So surely he would have come. So they start questioning, who is he? Is he the Messiah? Why is he here now? Etc. And then we see Jesus displaying the gifts he has been given as the Messiah. We see him. They go to the tomb, which is a cave, which has a stone up, against it. The stone is moved, and then Lazarus comes out. So it's kind of a foreshadowing, a precursor, if you will, of Holy Week, of the resurrection. There are women at the tomb. They go with Jesus. There's women Easter morning at the tomb, the first people to see that Jesus is not there. It's different, of course, because Lazarus is there, and then he is raised from the dead. He's resuscitated, given new life. And I always wonder what Lazarus' life is like after that. Is he seen as kind of this oddity in the village of Bethany? Hey, that guy was dead for 4 days, and now look, was he really dead? I'm sure there's a lot of speculation about Lazarus afterward. He would have been an oddity. People probably would have just wanted to get a glimpse of him, right? So I think about that. I think about Lazarus, and there's a lot in this story. And we're going to talk more about this story, but we are going to take another quick break. So stay tuned, and we will be right back. As part of this break, I wanted to speak with you once again about Birch Gold Group, which is one of the top dealers of physical precious metals in the United States. Birch Gold Group helps Americans diversify their savings with gold and silver. Customers can purchase for physical possession or convert a portion of their IRA or 401k into an IRA backed by physical precious metals. In 2008, the U.S. national debt was $10 trillion. Today, it's over $23 trillion, and it's still rising. If you don't think we're sitting on a house of cards, then you're probably living with your head in the sand. But you're listening to this podcast, and so you maybe need a plan. Maybe you're looking for a plan. Because can you really afford another hit to your retirement like the last downturn when the S&P dropped 50%? Probably not. You can hedge against inflation and hedge against uncertainty and instability with precious metals. Gold is a safe haven against uncertainty. Right now, thanks to a little-known IRS tax law, you can move your IRA or eligible 401k into an IRA backed by physical gold and silver. It's perfect for those who want to protect their hard-earned retirement savings from any future geopolitical certainty. When you look back historically, when the bottom falls out of everything else, gold tends to safeguard savings. So Birch Gold Group has helped thousands of satisfied customers, countless 5-star reviews, and has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. Contact Birch Gold Group today to request a free info kit on physical precious metals. See if diversifying into gold and silver makes sense for you. This comprehensive 20-page kit reveals how gold and silver can protect your savings and how you can legally move your IRA or 401k out of risky stocks and bonds and into a precious metals IRA. To get your no-cost, no-obligation kit, go to birchgold.com/Bible. That's BIRCH gold.com/Bible.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast. Before the break, I read through the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 1 through 45, which is assigned for the last Sunday in Lent. This year, that was April 2nd. And now I want to move on. I said some of my initial thoughts about that. I want to move on to some thoughts from another commentator, this time from Carolyn Lewis, who's the Associate Professor of Preaching at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she writes that it is significant that the story of Lazarus, which is unique to the Gospel of John, it's not in the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, which is unique to the Gospel of John, is the Gospel reading for the last Sunday in Lent, the Sunday immediately preceding Palm Sunday. For the Synoptic Gospels, and again that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the cleansing of the temple is the impetus for the plot to kill Jesus. But she says that in the Gospel of John, the temple scene is moved to the beginning of the Gospel, immediately following the wedding at Cana, and it is the raising of Lazarus to life that incites the plot for Jesus' arrest and death. In John, chapter 11, verses 46 through 57, the verses immediately following what we just read, the chief priests and the Pharisees are told what Jesus did, and from that day on, they plan to put him to death. Moreover, the chief priests want to get rid of the evidence as well and plan to put Lazarus to death, since it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and were believing in Jesus. So how crazy is that? That's not something that we often think about when we read this story of Lazarus. I mentioned before the break that I always wonder what Lazarus' life was like. Well, clearly, people were noticing. It says that there were many people who had come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, and it's interesting that the one translation says they were deserting. They were believing in Jesus, so they were deserting their initial belief and believing in Jesus. And so they were also plotting to kill Lazarus. So poor Lazarus, who's already died once and didn't ask to be raised from the dead, is now being plotted against by the Pharisees, by the chief priests. And then she continues to say that it is Jesus' very claim, I am the resurrection and the life, that provokes his death in the fourth gospel, in John's gospel. The repercussions of the raising of Lazarus are not included in the lectionary reading or any time in the 3-year lectionary cycle, and should either be read or referenced as she does. She says it's important to reference those repercussions. So it's important to know that Jesus' claim in this text, I am the resurrection and the life, and the fact that he raises Lazarus from the dead is important. She says the raising of Lazarus is the last of Jesus' signs in the Gospel of John. So chapter 12, the chapter following this one, functions as a bridge chapter before the narrative halts in time for Jesus' last meal and words to his disciples. So the actual raising of Lazarus, she says, is narrated in only 2 verses. The rest of that is all lead-in before he actually raises Lazarus. The events, discussion, and details prior to the main event receive the bulk of the narrative space. So she's saying that that's important to pay attention to. She asks, why does Jesus comment on the sign before actually raising Lazarus from the dead? On one level, it seems that what precedes the miracle is just as important. In other words, Jesus' interpretation of the meaning of the sign is perhaps as or more critical than the sign itself. So Jesus that leads us back again to what I was saying. Jesus waits a couple of days and then he travels, and he says that he's glad his disciples are with him because then they will be able to see, maybe they'll be able to understand. This way he's able to perform this sign in front of a large group of Jews who are there gathered with Mary and Martha. And John's gospel is a lot about signs. So, there's the wedding at Cana, which is not told in the other gospels. And it's about Jesus' signs showing that Jesus is the Messiah. They're the I am sayings in the Gospel of John. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the bread. I am the true bread. I am the vine. I am the shepherd, etc., etc. John's Gospel really works hard to explain who Jesus is as the Messiah, whereas the other Gospels tend to take a more narrative approach towards laying out the events of Jesus' life up to the point where he goes to Jerusalem. John's Gospel is less narrative and more about telling who Jesus is, who this Messiah is, how we recognize him as the Messiah. So, Ms. Lewis goes on to say, this is not to say that the raising of Lazarus is not important. The narrative elements that set up Lazarus coming out of the tomb are significant. They contribute both to the narrative suspense and to the extraordinary final scene of Lazarus, dead man walking. We are told that the tomb was a cave and that there was a stone against it, that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Since Jewish belief held that the soul left the body after 3 days, just in case we are wondering, Lazarus is really dead, and he is going to smell. Jesus then pauses to pray, and this prayer is more than demonstrative. Jesus thanks God for hearing him. And how is Lazarus raised? By hearing Jesus. Like the sheep that recognize the voice of the shepherd who calls them by name. And again, that's referencing back to one of those I am statements. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The sheep hear the voice of their shepherd. They recognize the voice of their shepherd. Here, Lazarus hears the voice of Jesus, even though he's dead, even though by Jewish tradition and belief his soul has left his body, he has been dead 4 days, he is really, truly dead. He hears Jesus. He recognized Jesus' voice, and he hears his name being called, and the dead man comes out. And this is significant. This goes back. She's talking about, again, the shepherd. Only the shepherd can lead his sheep out, she says. So that's significant to relate that back to the I am statement of I am the shepherd. Again, we should ask, though, she says, why does Jesus need to talk about the raising of Lazarus prior to doing it? Is it because that the sign would be easily misunderstood, even by us? When we think about the raising of Lazarus, do we place our focus on I am the resurrection and not remember that Jesus also says, I am the life? Indeed, this is exactly what Martha thinks. Notice her dialogue with Jesus in 11:21 through 27. When Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again, she hears only the promise of a future resurrection. I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus seems to correct this misunderstanding. I am the resurrection and the life. But Jesus, we might ask, what is the difference? I like this interpretation. I like where she's leading us with this because I don't think we often think about that. I am the resurrection and the life. With the focus of Holy Week being Jesus' death and resurrection, we don't often think about Jesus being the resurrection and the life. And she says that this is a question that has been puzzled out by others as well. She says other ancient manuscripts omit and the life, with the assumption that this phrase is a redundancy on the part of Jesus. Our first impressions may be the same. We tend to focus on the resurrection that we situate for ourselves as a distant promise, our guarantee of salvation, our eternal life with God and Jesus in heaven. But what might it mean that Jesus is the resurrection and the life? That we are raised to life, not as future salvific existence, but to the life right here, right now, with Jesus. Let's go ahead now and take our second break of the podcast. And when I come back, I'll be speaking more about this story of Jesus and Lazarus and Mary and Martha. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast. I am speaking today, the last Sunday of Lent, on the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. For Lazarus, the Gospel does not describe his future with Jesus, but his present. In chapter 12, the anointing of Jesus takes place at the home of Mary and Martha in Bethany. We are told that Martha served, Mary anoints Jesus, and Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead, was one of those at the table with him. The raising of Lazarus also gives him new life with Jesus. This new life is leaning on the breast of Jesus, reclining at the table with him, sharing food and fellowship. Now, new life in Jesus is the intimacy, this closeness, this dwelling, lying on the chest of Jesus. It is here and now, because for the Gospel of John, it is not just the death of Jesus, but the life of Jesus that brings about salvation. For the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, through which we shall receive grace upon grace. Of course, she's referencing back to the very beginning of the Gospel of John, when the Word becomes flesh, when Jesus is born into this world. And I really like her commentary on this. I really like the way her commentary made me think a little differently, because I do think we hear "I am the resurrection and the life" and just kind of conflate those two things. We just think "I am the resurrection and the life," same thing, a little bit redundant. Maybe we would omit that as well as some of the ancient manuscripts do. But I am the life. We are with Jesus right now. Yes, we have the future, the promises of future resurrection. We have the promise of that life eternal with Jesus. But we also have the promise of Jesus being with us in this life that we have right now. We know that God is with us. We know that God has given us work to do. We know that God has given us gifts, that God loves us so that we in turn can love each other. Jesus is with us in this life. So when we look around this world and we see our brothers and sisters, we are there with them. We are representatives of Jesus to each other. Jesus is represented to me by other people. I am representative of Jesus to other people. Jesus is with us right now. We are with Jesus in that intimate relationship, that close relationship, dwelling with Jesus, lying intimately with him, it says on his chest, or, you can just kind of think of it as kind of laying with your head on Jesus' shoulder if you want to be, kind of literal about it. But that is the promise. It's not just the resurrection. It's the resurrection and the life. We have been given this life to live here, and we can make the world a better place. And so that, for me, is what I'm taking with me from this season of Lent. I didn't do the things that I wanted to do during the season of Lent. I did not accomplish the things that I set for myself. I did not accomplish my spiritual disciplines. And I could dwell on that, and I could beat myself up about it, and I probably will if you want the truth, because that tends to be how I am. I tend toward being a perfectionist, and so I'm harder on myself than almost anyone else. But this text reminds me that yes, I have been given the gift of grace, as I said at the beginning. Yes, I've been given the promises of the resurrection. But Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And regardless of the fact that, I spent Lent running around crazily trying to, do too many things and having what seemed like everything go wrong. Of course, it wasn't everything. This reminds me that Jesus is there with me in the midst of that craziness, in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the struggle and the frustration, saying, I am the resurrection and the life. I am here. Lean on me. Be in this intimate relationship with me. I love you. God loves you. God has given you this love. God has given you these promises. And so I can dwell on my failure, if you want to see it that way. I can dwell on the fact that I didn't do what I'd hoped to do, what I'd planned to do. Or I can move into this Holy Week secure in knowing that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. So that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining me as we discussed the gospel reading assigned for the last Sunday in Lent. That was John chapter 11, verses 1 through 45. I hope you will join me again as we travel through Holy Week from Palm Sunday to Maundy Thursday to Good Friday and finally to Easter and those promises of the resurrection and the life. So again, thank you for joining me. Thank you for staying at home and doing your part to help flatten the curve. If you are one of those essential people who is out there making it safe for the rest of us to stay home, thank you so very, very much. I pray for you on a daily basis, whether you are a doctor, a nurse, an EMT, the staff at all of the hospitals who are working so hard and don't often get the recognition that the doctors and nurses get, the people who are keeping the grocery stores open, the people who are making deliveries so the rest of us can stay home. There are so many people who are putting their own health at risk to make sure that the rest of us can stay home and help to flatten that curve. So please stay home if you are a non-essential person and can work from home. Don't be going out unnecessarily and follow all the guidelines for staying safe when you do go out. If you are a fan of this podcast, and hopefully you are since you just listened to this episode, please do follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter, and you can leave comments there. You can interact with me. I would love to hear from you. That would be wonderful. Also, if you are a fan of this podcast, it would really help us if you could give us a nice review, whether that be written or 5-star. That helps us to get the GSMC Bible Study Podcast out to more listeners like yourselves. Thank you so much for joining me. Join me again next week for Palm Sunday and the beginning of Holy Week. In the meantime, stay safe, stay home, and please do remember that you are a beautiful and beloved child of God. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.